It is called Postal, a software offering already being hailed as a hit even before its scheduled September release. To anyone unfamiliar with computer software games, the blood and the mayhem of Postal could be a shock.
Uva, tell me about Postal. I'm told it's insulting, irreverent, politically incorrect. Is it...
Tonight from the Night Team, a new game that encourages kids to kill priests and blow up animals. The Night Team with the controversy over this vicious video game. Plus,
Ugh, I regret nothing. That's the stuff. Me, I better get home. Are you gonna sign this, or will it be your surviving family members?
Now, if I asked you what the most controversial game was, what would you say? Maybe something like the disaster that was Concord, or maybe games that had terrible releases and didn't give us what was promised, like Cyberpunk and No Man's Sky. Both of which eventually recovered their reputation, and one is constantly releasing free updates. Or maybe you'd even say the coffin of Andrew and Lele, with how some people reacted to certain parts of the game, and the public witch hunt that took place going after the creator. But if you said any of those games, you are wrong. And I know I already made a video like this about one of said games I just mentioned, but I was discussing a popular opinion of that time, so shut the fuck up. But no, there is one game that is so controversial it has been banned in multiple countries. It offended multiple groups of people with claims of it being sexist, racist and homophobic from elements present within the game. The gameplay itself on the release of the earlier entries to the franchise had parents of that time shaking in their boots and worrying their children were going to be corrupted. But despite the outside reputation, this is a legendary game franchise that is revered by many, with many of its iconic lines being embedded in internet culture.
Hi there, would you like to sign my petition?
Not only do I not want to back this, I'm going to actively tell people not.
And as a result has also developed a cult following that still exists to this day. A cult following that has also been very critical of some of the later entries to the franchise, and apparently had a hand at cancelling an entry to the franchise that allegedly used AI. This game was so popular that at one point they released a movie of it, which not everybody liked. But the game franchise I'm talking about is Postal, which had its first entry of said franchise in 1997 with Postal 1, where for the first time we saw the iconic Postal dude, someone known for his one-liners and very recognisable voice.
Damn, here I was minding my own business, just enjoying my Second Amendment rights, and you people have to freak out on me.
However, in the first game, he's not the sarcastic, comedic, lovable psychopath we know later in the series, who's just kind of a mentally ill, paranoid psychopath, especially with what law was present, and was mainly killing people down to said paranoid delusions. The first game was also an isometric top-down shooter instead of first person as most would know it, and it was also a lot darker compared to the later games. The main goal of the first game is just to kill, or kill enough people to progress to the next area. There are no other objectives. It is either kill a certain amount of people or kill all of them. There is no non-lethal option to progress. The game was made by Running with Scissors, founded by Vince Desi, who is also known as Chief Big Dick, and he founded the studio a year prior to Postal's release in 1996, and Postal is seemingly the only game the studio has produced, and despite their only product being surrounded in controversy and some of their additions to the franchise being hated, the studio is fairly loved by its fans, from regularly responding to its community to telling them if they can't afford their games to straight up pirate them. But anyway, back to Postal. The first game on release was considered controversial seemingly out of the gate, and even before its release, from the claims it contained senseless mass killing to what they would say was extreme gore of that time. Keep in mind, games around that time usually had an objective tied to why you would shoot people, like the enemy being an evil demon, a bad guy, or simply out of self-defense. But Postal didn't have that. You were basically a schizophrenic madman that was gunning down mostly unarmed civilians in the setting of a small town, which for those times made people lose their minds, and keep in mind this was just before the release of the first Grand Theft Auto. The game was viewed as very controversial to say the least, and was heavily criticised by the media of that time, mainly due to the ending where you find yourself outside of school with what is believed to be a hallucination of children, of which you open fire, destroying the school and the playground. However, one thing you couldn't do is open fire on the kids or harm them. They were practically invincible. But that wasn't what was told by certain media outlets and published articles, who warned the public about how graphic the game was and that you could actually open fire and harm children, which once again, you couldn't. And it was one of the biggest pieces of misinformation surrounding the game at the time. But in the ending of the original Postal 1, although ambiguous, it is assumed Postal Dude had a mental breakdown, gets captured, and then is put in a mental asylum. And that is basically the game, but as said, before the game even released, it was already controversial. Firstly, just by the name itself, the title Postal was said to be influenced by the phrase going postal, which refers to someone getting angry to the point of violence, usually in the workplace. And that phrase originated from a series of shootings that occurred in the late 1980s, where United States Postal Service employees in so-called incidents of workplace rage would shoot and kill other employees in acts of mass murder, and then quite often finally turn the gun on themselves. At the time, some believed employees were going so-called postal because of improper management and working conditions, tight deadlines, and an overall change to the way the United States Postal Office traditionally ran. But that is where the phrase going postal came from, and in the current day, it's rarely used. However, in 1997, before the release of Postal, the United States Postal Service, or USPS, would attempt to sue the studio running with scissors over the name of the game. But the lawsuit would be dismissed due to the studio stating that it had nothing to do with the Postal Service or its employees. It was dismissed in June of 2003, which was after the release of their continuation to the series, Postal 2. The first game was also banned or heavily restricted in multiple countries such as New Zealand, Australia, Germany, Malaysia, and France. French! And it was mostly banned due to the violence present in the game. But keep in mind, this was just their first game. Yes, just the first game alone faced a media uproar, legal battles, and bans in multiple countries, and the second game was only going to be even more controversial and essentially add gasoline to the fire with no regrets. But finally, they would remaster the first Postal with Postal Redux in 2016, which not only improved the graphics and added extra content to the game, but also changed the ending from the school to the postal dude watching a funeral that is interpreted to be his own. But now we get on to the magnum opus of the Postal series, the most iconic addition to the franchise, Postal 2. Postal 2 was released on the 14th of April 2003, and it saw the same level of criticism, if not worse, than what the first entry saw. And the Running with Scissors studio, despite how controversial the first game was, did not shy away from achieving the same thing with this game. And they did not hold back, they did not provide any lube. This game was essentially supposed to be as offensive as possible, and it was a success. From Chief Big Dick himself apparently becoming #1 in the US and Russia, and doing very well in other countries, on top of selling out in stores like GameStop and Electronic Boutique, selling its initial shipment of 50,000 copies. However, despite intending to be offensive and making the game a lot more comical and less serious compared to the first game, it obviously wasn't immune from criticism from the media to certain groups said to be represented within the game, but as like with the first game, it faced critiques from the media regarding the graphical content possible within the game, especially regarding the gore system where you could decapitate NPCs and then urinate on said decapitated NPC. This guy really needs to hydrate, his piss is yellower than SpongeBob. But once again, the game and studio knew the media storm was going to head their way. This wasn't their first rodeo, and they were very self-aware to the point where even in the game they directly address it.
Bad. Games are bad, they make you mad. Games are bad, they make you mad. Games are bad, they make you mad. Games are bad, they make you mad.
Honestly, I wonder what the same critics would have said 3 years later with the release of Gears of War. There was also a difficulty called Liber mode, which makes it so all NPCs have no weapons, making the game extremely easy, and the name of the difficulty refers to Joe Lieberman, who claimed violent video games lead to an increase in crime. Some were outraged by what you could do to animals in the game, being able to decapitate them and in some cases use them as a silencer on your weapon. Some were offended by racial stereotypes and the presence of things like Al-Qaeda, with members blowing themselves up, but it's obvious the game and studio were attempting to push the boundaries of that time, and the same game probably wouldn't be able to release in the current day. But for at least the violence present, as said on the box, the game is only as violent as you make it. You can do a complete pacifist run, not harming or killing anyone, which is the polar opposite of the first game. The objectives within the game are rather trivial as well. For the base game, you just have to make it from Monday to Friday, completing tasks like going to the bank where you have to wait in line, and confessing your sins where you have to wait in line, and buying milk where you have to wait in line. Yeah, the game does not make it easy when doing a pacifist run. It's more tedious in testing your anger management skills more than anything. But the game puts forward an important question: is the game really to blame for the violent content just for giving you access to a sandbox where you can do these things? Or are you to blame for performing these actions when the game does not require you to do them to progress? Well, regardless of the answer to said important question, regardless of the satirical nature, and regardless of the fact it was intending to be offensive, the game, like its previous entries, was banned in just as many countries. In New Zealand, it was even a crime to just possess the game. Some game retailers refused to even stock or sell the game. Germany eventually prevented the game from being available to its citizens on Steam. News outlets condemned the game. Even in some cases, like in 2008, the game was blamed for a string of arson performed by 3 19-year-olds. It was mentioned in 2006 regarding a shooting in Montreal which killed 1 woman and injured 19 others, where in one article the shooter supposedly was a fan of the game and thought it was too tame and wanted something more extreme. Postal was constantly used by the media in the ongoing discussion that games influence people, especially children, to do violent acts. But despite the media backlash, the game once again is iconic, from the quotes,
"The gene pool is stagnant, and I am the minister of chlorine,"
to elements like the iconic petition clipboard.
"Hi there, would you like to sign my petition?"
What are we doing here?
The studio knew they had hit a gold mine, and in December of the same year would release an expansion to Postal 2 called Postal 2 Share the Pain, which added multiplayer modes and extra weapons. And then in 2005 they added the expansion Apocalypse Weekend, adding Saturday and Sunday to the game, with more content and even a cutscene with Chief Big Dick himself, where he explains the pigeon hunting mission is way beyond the budget, and it just cuts to a message from the management team and the aftermath of probably one of the best missions in Postal history.
Proposal for the pigeon mission.
Proposal for the pigeon mission? We ain't got no budget for pigeon missions. The fuck, are you kidding me?
Vince, the kids. Gotta think of the kids.
Look at the quality of this video!
They even had specific adaptations of the game for Japanese and Russian audiences. They even released an expansion a decade later with Postal 2 Paradise Lost, where Postal Dude wakes up from a decade-long coma and it provides a continuation to the story with new weapons and a new map. And this expansion was certainly more loved than the continuation to the franchise that was released 4 years prior, Postal 3, which is one of the most hated additions to the franchise. But going back to Postal 2 momentarily, yes, it is one of the most loved games out of all the Postals, but in the current year where some games have pushed past the so-called controversial content of the second Postal, especially in terms of gore, Postal 2 still remains banned in multiple countries. And Running with Scissors had attempted to get them unbanned, and in one case de-indexed from Germany, where a lot of games were starting to get removed from the index, and games like Grand Theft Auto were never outright banned from being sold like Postal 2 was. But even when they hired a law firm and took it higher up, the game would still remain on the index and is still banned in places like Germany to this day. But anyway, onto one of the least loved games I've mentioned about 5 times now that was so hated even the founder of Running with Scissors hated it.
My personal feelings about Postal 3
unfortunately, are riddled with pain.
So Postal 3 was different from the previous two Postals, not because it was now in third person. Yes, they've transitioned from an isometric top-down shooter to a first-person shooter to now a third-person shooter. And no, the fourth didn't evolve to have you playing from the perspective of a piss stain. But it was different because Running with Scissors was not the primary studio working on it. Yes, they were behind what happened in the game and what they wanted in it, but another studio called Akela, located in Russia, was behind most of the implementation and coding of said desired elements. And initially it seemed like a good idea due to how popular Postal was in Russia, and Russia was one of the countries that had barely any restrictions on the Postal franchise. But obviously it didn't pan out the way they wanted, and something heavily to blame for that is the financial crisis of 2007 to 2008. Postal 3 was in development for roughly 5 to 6 years, and it was not immune from the effects of the financial crash. Akela had to fire what was called the A-Team, the people that were said to be the best people working on the game, and from there the development of the game would transfer through multiple hands, being scrapped and rebuilt multiple times, often each time by either a different or somewhat less experienced team. And meanwhile, Running with Scissors were not kept in the loop about this at all, or what was happening with said game, and the specifications they did provide were not being followed or translated into the final release of the game. But Postal 3 would release in 2011, apparently as a last-ditch effort by Akela to prevent bankruptcy, and the game was a mess. It had multiple bugs, glitches, for some the game wouldn't even boot, the gameplay was repetitive, the humour cringy, and the story hated. Akela would provide one final patch in 2012, but the game was already dead by then. And because of issues between Akela and Running with Scissors, like them not providing the source code, so I assume they could fix it themselves, Running with Scissors would cut ties with Akela and the company would go bankrupt in the same year of 2012. Now, Running with Scissors completely disowned this game, where to this day if you go to their store and click on it, you get rickrolled. The story would be retconned and treated more as a hallucination in the 2015 release of Postal 2 Paradise Lost expansion.
What the hell is this shit?
In 2022, the game would actually be removed from Steam because of a DRM issue, something Running with Scissors had no control over, and if they had the choice, they would have sold the game for free. However, it would be put back on Steam shortly afterwards, where even to this day, no matter the price, people say it's still not worth it. But while this game failed and left a stain on the reputation of Running with Scissors, in the optimistic words of Chief Big Dick himself,
Postal 3, thank God it ended. But the good news is, it made the way for Postal 4.
Now, Postal 4, no regrets, unlike 3, was developed entirely by Running with Scissors. It released for early access in 2019, which was the first game in the franchise to be released as such, a technically unfinished game that would slowly be built up through ongoing updates. Technically, it wasn't the first unfinished game they released, but it was a continuation to the story from where Postal 2 Paradise Lost finished off, because once again, Postal 3 never happened. Now, because it was early access, the game in some builds was of course buggy, sometimes unplayable, and they were still adding content to the game, but it would come out of early access in 2022, and still had quite a bit of bugs. Some recent reviews say the game still feels unfinished in the current day. Some would say the game looks kind of lifeless, something similar to an asset flip game, and has a lot of performance issues. They are still releasing patches to the game every now and again, but the main critique of the game was that it's just mediocre, and it was constantly being compared to Postal 2, which at this point is impossible to beat. It was still definitely better than Postal 3, and fans thought it was a respectable continuation to where Postal 2 left off, but it just wasn't Postal 2 or better than it, which is a common problem in the game industry. Believe me, every Halo after the original trilogy has been called abysmal dog shit compared to the first 3, and a lot of them are. Except Reach. You can actually eat my left nut if you think Reach is bad. But it is extremely hard to capture and recreate what made a game series so good at its peak without copying it exactly or going in a completely different direction, attempting to innovate and revitalize the franchise. and Postal 4 is in the in-between. It is a Postal game, it has a lot of Postal 2 in it and adds a lot of content and modern features to it, but it doesn't fully detach itself from its predecessor to shine for itself and set a new bar for the series like people were thinking the 4th would. It is a good successor to Postal 2 though, it just needs to apparently work on its performance. Now there was another entry to the series that fans absolutely loved and used to on the 4th entry, that being Postal Brain Damage, released in June of 2022. The game was developed by Hyperstrange and Creative Forge Games, with Running with Scissors being involved with the publishing of the game, and it turns Postal from an open world game to something more like a Doom game. There is no open sandbox, it is a linear level based game, you kill enemies and progress to the next area. And lore wise you are inside the head of Postal Dude, so it doesn't really affect the lore of the franchise much. But despite not being like the traditional Postal games, it was well received, from the retro graphics to the simple yet fun gameplay. But now that we're talking about spin-offs, we have to mention the latest addition to the franchise that landed Running with Scissors in hot water, this time not with the media, but with its own fans. Postal Bullet Paradise once again was not like your traditional Postal game. It was a roguelike wave survival game, basically something like Risk of Rain, where once again it had a change up of the graphics with pixel art enemies and retro environments, and it was announced December 3rd, 2025, and then cancelled a day later on the 4th of December. The game lasted a full 24 hours after only being announced, and it was primarily down to the developer of said game, Goon Swarm. Yeah. Goon Swarm, that should have been the first red flag to be honest, but the issue with said company was with the announcement. Some thought the sprites and art looked a bit off, like AI had something to do with it, and people began looking at the studio's previous work where you can sort of see the same thing. And what makes it worse, if it was AI, a week earlier Running with Scissors took a stance on AI in video games, saying that customers deserve to know if their game was made with AI. People would start to question both the development studio and Running with Scissors regarding this. The studio would be adamant they didn't use AI, and the co-owner of Running with Scissors in their Discord would basically shit on anyone saying they used AI. However, on December 4th, with fan backlash, Running with Scissors would make a statement cancelling the game and saying it was very likely AI generation was involved, and apologised to anyone who felt insulted. But it doesn't stop there, because the cherry on top is Goon Swarm Games would shut down with a statement where they were adamant they did not use AI, and then another statement saying AI was used, they just didn't know. Yeah, the game literally lasted a day. Anyway, that's where Postal sits today. It is still regarded as one of the worst and most controversial games by both the media and government bodies, but is hailed as a comedic, enjoyable, timeless masterpiece by those on the internet. And it has proven hard to recreate or improve upon said masterpiece, even for the studio that made it. Even with the many struggles Running with Scissors has faced over the years, from a game that didn't work to a game that for many didn't have the desired effect to a game that got cancelled within a day, it has always listened to its fans, and despite how it has been constantly condemned throughout its entire existence, it still never buckled under the scrutiny or apologised to anyone but their own fans. And it is definitely a one-of-a-kind studio, from the people behind it to the series that had an obscene effect on both the internet and gaming. We'll probably see another entry to the Postal series soon, and hopefully they continue to patch 4. I think people are still having performance issues with it. But yeah, that's all I had to say, and bye-bye.